At 2:17 in the morning on August 29, 1944, somewhere on the dark road east of Chartres, Private First Class Willie Jackson kept both hands locked around the wheel of a 2.5-ton truck. The truck was not new. Nothing about it looked heroic. Its canvas cover was stained with dust and oil. Its fenders were dented. The windshield had been wiped clean so many times that the glass carried long pale scratches, visible only when another vehicle's masked headlight passed across it. Behind him, in the cargo bed, metal jerrycans knocked against one another with a dull, nervous rhythm. Gasoline. Enough to move tanks a little farther. Enough to keep artillery tractors alive. Enough to turn tomorrow morning from a pause into another attack. Jackson's eyes burned from lack of sleep. His shirt stuck to his back. The air inside the cab smelled of sweat, hot metal, cigarette smoke, and fuel vapor. Every few minutes, the engine coughed, and he felt the vibration run through the steering column into his wrists. On the road ahead, a military policeman stood under a blackout lamp, one arm raised, white gloves appearing and disappearing in the dark like pieces of bone. No one on that road could see the front. The front was somewhere beyond the villages, beyond the blown bridges, beyond the farm fields crushed by tanks and half-tracks. It was marked by artillery flashes and radio messages, not by lines on a clean map. But the front was waiting for men like Jackson, not waiting for speeches, not waiting for flags, waiting for fuel. Somewhere ahead, a tank commander might have been sitting on the turret of his Sherman, listening to the silence of an engine that could not move without gasoline. Somewhere in a battery position, an artillery sergeant might have been counting shells and pretending not to worry. Somewhere in a field headquarters, a young officer might have been looking at a map and realizing that the arrows drawn in grease pencil were moving faster than the trucks behind them. Jackson did not know all of that. He knew the truck. He knew the load. He knew the road was supposed to stay one way. He knew he was not supposed to stop unless forced. He knew that if a tire blew, he might have to change it in the dark while other trucks crawled around him and someone cursed from behind. He knew that if he fell asleep, the truck could leave the road, roll into a ditch, and burn. He also knew that men like him were not usually placed at the center of victory. The army called him support, rear area, service troops, transportation. Necessary, yes, but not the kind of soldier whose face appeared in combat photographs. The newspapers liked infantrymen climbing through rubble, pilots beside their aircraft, tank crews with goggles pushed up on their helmets. A truck driver did not make the same picture. He carried boxes. He followed signs. He waited in line. He loaded, drove, unloaded, turned around, and did it again. But in that late summer darkness, the distinction was beginning to collapse. A tank without fuel was not a tank in any meaningful sense. It was a steel bunker with tracks. A cannon without shells was a tube. A rifle company without food could hold for a while, but not forever. A field hospital without plasma, bandages, and morphine became a place where men waited in pain for supplies that should already have arrived. The German commanders facing the Americans in France understood many things about war. They understood armor. They understood artillery. They understood the value of ground, bridges, crossroads, and timing. They had watched armies break before. They had caused some of those breaks themselves. They knew that fast advances could outrun their supply lines. They knew that every mile forward stretched a force thinner. That was what they were counting on. They believed the American advance would choke on distance. They believed fuel and ammunition would fail to keep up with ambition. They believed the roads of France, damaged by bombing, clogged by refugees, torn by retreat and pursuit, would slow the enemy down. They believed that if German forces could survive long enough, the Americans would be forced to stop, reorganize, wait, and become vulnerable. And in some ways, they were right. The Americans were stretched. Their supply lines were under terrible strain. Their armies were moving faster than their planners had expected. Ports were damaged or still too far behind. Railways were broken. Fuel had to be hauled forward by truck, and the trucks burned fuel while carrying fuel. Every solution created another problem. But what German commanders did not fully grasp, not soon enough, was the scale of the machine forming behind the American spearheads. It was not clean. It was not elegant. It was not perfectly planned. It ran on improvisation, exhaustion, discipline, and human endurance. It ran on drivers who had not slept enough. It ran on mechanics lying under trucks in the mud. It ran on military police at intersections. It ran on clerks, loaders, dispatchers, tire repair crews, depot men, and soldiers whose names rarely survived in the main story. The German army looked for the decisive enemy in the wrong place. It looked at the tank. It heard the artillery. It watched the fighter bombers. But behind all of them, in darkness and dust, came the trucks. Jackson eased the gear lever forward. The truck lurched, then steadied. The military policeman waved him through. Ahead, the road bent into a deeper black. Behind him, the convoy crawled on, engine after engine, load after load, a moving line of fuel and ammunition stretching back toward the rear. No one on that road knew exactly how history would describe them. They only knew the front was hungry, and it had to be fed before dawn. But the men waiting for the Americans to stall did not yet understand the cruelest part of this new kind of war. The real danger was not simply that American trucks could carry supplies. It was that they could carry time. What Germany thought an army was. For German commanders, an army was supposed to have a shape. It had spearheads. It had flanks. It had strong points and reserves. It had armored divisions, infantry divisions, artillery groups, reconnaissance units, engineers, headquarters, railheads, supply dumps, repair shops, and field kitchens. It moved through space according to roads, bridges, fuel, orders, weather, and enemy resistance. On a staff map, these things became symbols, rectangles, arrows, dotted lines, estimated positions, probable intentions. The danger with a map is that it can make war look more obedient than it is. By 1944, many German officers had spent years thinking about movement. They had lived through the early victories, or at least inherited their lessons. Poland, France, the opening months in the Soviet Union. They had seen what happened when speed broke the defender's mind faster than it broke his units. A sudden penetration, a flank turned, communications severed, headquarters displaced, roads filled with retreating troops. Then the next blow before anyone could settle. Speed had been a German language. Not the only one, not always successful, but deeply familiar. The Wehrmacht had once made other armies feel late to their own battles. So when American units broke out of Normandy and began rushing across France, German commanders did not look at that movement with simple confusion. They had their own memories of pursuit. They knew what speed could do, but they also knew what speed required. Fuel, tires, repair parts, ammunition, food, roads, bridges, traffic control, rest, signal discipline. The faster an army moved, the more fragile it could become. A spearhead that pushed too far could become isolated. A tank column that ran out of gasoline could be cut off. A supply column caught on a road could burn for hours. That was the logic, and it was not foolish. The Americans had landed in Normandy on a coast, not inside a complete logistics system. Their armies had to be supplied across beaches and through damaged ports. The French rail network had been heavily attacked. Bridges had been blown. Roads were cratered, crowded, and often badly marked. The farther the front moved east, the longer the haul became. Every gallon that reached a tank had traveled through a chain of labor, fuel dumps, trucks, roads, and men. German officers expected friction to do what German units increasingly could not. They expected distance to become an ally. In a headquarters room, perhaps in a chateau, perhaps in a cellar, perhaps inside a building with windows covered against air attack, a German staff officer could look at a map of France and see the problem clearly. The Americans were moving away from their base. Their lines were lengthening. Their appetite was growing. If bridges were destroyed, if roads were blocked, if delaying positions held even briefly, the enemy's advance should lose force. The belief had comfort in it. Not hope exactly. By late summer 1944, hope was becoming more difficult for many German commanders to handle honestly. But there was still calculation. There was still the professional instinct that war punished overextension. There was still the thought that the Americans, for all their equipment and air power, could not escape the old rules entirely. No army could. Yet the German army itself was trapped by its own contradiction. It understood logistics, but it did not possess the same kind of logistics. It had never been motorized on the American scale. German propaganda and later popular memory liked the image of fast armored columns, but much of the German army still depended on horses, railways, and limited motor transport. Its own fuel position had worsened year after year. Allied bombing, battlefield losses, and shrinking resources made German mobility more fragile. German commanders could imagine the American supply crisis because they knew what such a crisis meant. But they imagined it through the limits of their own system. That was the hidden error. They expected American speed to be followed by American exhaustion. They expected the roads to become clogged beyond use. They expected the fuel problem to impose a pause long enough for German units to recover. They expected pursuit to become disorder. And sometimes it did. American formations did stop. Commanders did argue over fuel priorities. Units did wait for supplies. Tanks did sit dry. Some advances slowed because the trucks could not keep up with every demand at once. The American system was not magic, and the men inside it knew that better than anyone. A driver who had spent 18 hours behind the wheel did not believe in miracles. A mechanic staring at a cracked axle did not believe in slogans. A quartermaster officer looking at tonnage reports did not believe in endless abundance. But they did believe in movement. That was the difference. The American army had been built by a country that thought in machines, roads, assembly lines, oil, tires, standardized parts, paperwork, and replacement flow. Could waste too much. Could be clumsy. Could bury simple decisions under bureaucracy. It could treat human beings unjustly and still depend on them completely. But once it began pushing material forward, it could do so with a weight that German commanders found difficult to measure from the far side of the battlefield. They saw the results first, not the system. A road that should have been empty was crowded with American vehicles. A unit that should have paused was firing again. A tank battalion that had consumed its fuel was somehow moving the next day. Artillery that should have gone quiet found more shells. Infantry that should have been hungry kept advancing. To German eyes, this could look like abundance. But abundance was only the surface. Underneath it was organization strained almost to breaking. Drivers were ordered onto routes they barely knew. Trucks were overloaded. Men were pushed past exhaustion. Maintenance was deferred because the front could not wait. Traffic rules were created not for neatness but survival. Every delay mattered because every delayed truck multiplied into delayed attacks, delayed medical care, delayed ammunition, delayed pressure. German commanders believed the American army was a mass of combat power that would eventually outrun its own tail. What they did not see was that the tail was becoming a weapon. Not glamorous, not silent, not clean. A weapon made of engines, fuel cans, grease, maps, and sleepless men. The realization would come slowly, through reports, failed expectations, and the repeated disappointment of seeing American pressure resume when it should have faded. But before that realization reached the command tables, the Americans had to solve a crisis of their own making. They had broken out. They were winning ground. And now victory itself was threatening to stop them. The breakout that broke the map. The hedgerows had taught the Americans patience in the ugliest way. For weeks after D-Day, the war in Normandy had been close, wet, and claustrophobic. Men fought from field to field, through sunken lanes and green walls that hid machine guns until they opened fire. Tanks could be ambushed at distances that felt almost personal. Mortar rounds fell into orchards. Artillery tore villages apart. Progress could be measured in yards, then paid for again the next morning. Then the front cracked. Operation Cobra opened a way through the German defenses, and once American forces began to move, the nature of the campaign changed with frightening speed. The same army that had been fighting through hedgerows now rushed across open country. Armored units pushed east and south. German formations, battered and disorganized, tried to escape encirclement. Roads filled with wreckage, prisoners, refugees, staff cars, ambulances, tanks, half-tracks, and supply vehicles trying to move through the same broken geography. A map that had been useful in the morning could feel old by evening. Commanders like George Patton wanted speed because speed could become destruction. If German forces were not given time to regroup, they could be pushed, split, trapped, and forced back toward the German border. Every hour mattered. Every day of pursuit made the enemy weaker. But pursuit is hungry. A tank does not move because a general wants it to move. It moves because fuel reaches it. Artillery does not fire because an arrow on a map points east. It fires because shells have arrived, fuses have arrived, propellant has arrived, and men have loaded them. Infantry can march, but even infantry becomes weaker without rations, ammunition, socks, boots, medicine, letters, and replacement equipment. Armies are living things only in a metaphorical sense. In reality, they are systems of consumption. The farther the Americans advanced, the more the system strained. The port of Cherbourg had been captured but heavily damaged. Other ports were not yet available or fully usable. The railways of France, bombed to hinder German movement before and after D-Day, could not instantly serve the Allied advance. Pipelines had not yet solved the fuel problem. Depots were too far behind. The roads became the answer because the roads were what remained. And so trucks became the emergency bridge between victory and paralysis. On August 25, 1944, the Red Ball Express began operating as a special priority trucking system. Its purpose was simple enough to say and brutal to execute. Move enormous quantities of supplies from the rear depots toward the fast-moving armies at the front. The name came from railroad language, where a red ball symbol marked priority freight. In France, the red ball became a road sign, a vehicle marking, and a kind of promise. This cargo moved first. The system had rules. Roads were marked. Some routes were made one way. Civilian traffic was restricted. Military police controlled intersections. Drivers were supposed to maintain spacing. Convoys were not supposed to stop casually. Trucks carried red ball markings so men along the road knew they belonged to the emergency lifeline. But a rule written in a headquarters has to survive the road. And the road in France was not a clean line. It was dust by day, darkness by night, and confusion almost always. Bridges could be weak or missing. Villages could create bottlenecks. Signs could be wrong or stolen. Drivers could get lost. Vehicles broke down. Overloaded trucks damaged tires and suspensions. Men drove too long and slept too little. They drank coffee when they could, smoked when they had cigarettes, and pushed on because the front kept asking for more. A convoy leaving the rear might carry fuel, ammunition, rations, medical supplies, spare parts, or all of these in different vehicles. The load mattered, but what mattered more was rhythm. Load, drive, unload, turn back, load again. The system was less like a single mission than a pulse. If the pulse weakened, the army slowed. There was something almost cruel in the arithmetic. Trucks carrying gasoline had to burn gasoline. A vehicle that moved fuel forward also consumed part of the solution. The longer the distance, the more expensive delivery became. Every mile east increased the burden. Every gallon poured into a truck's own tank was a gallon not poured into a Sherman or a command vehicle or an artillery tractor. The Americans were discovering that speed had a price that could not be paid once. It had to be paid every hour. In a forward area, a combat officer might ask where his fuel was. Behind him, someone in logistics might ask where more trucks could be found. Behind that officer, a dispatcher might ask why a convoy was late. Behind the dispatcher, a mechanic might be staring at a broken spring, knowing the truck was needed back on the road before the part was properly replaced. In every direction, men were solving problems that had no perfect solution. The Germans, watching from the other side, saw the American advance and waited for this strain to become decisive. They had reason to wait. By early September, some American units did begin to feel the shortage sharply. Patton's Third Army, racing across France, repeatedly demanded more fuel. Other armies needed supplies too. Commanders argued, priorities shifted, and the pursuit could not be fed everywhere at once. The American advance did not glide smoothly across France. It lurched, surged, paused, and surged again. That unevenness mattered. But it did not create the German recovery that some hoped for. The reason was not that the American supply crisis was imaginary. It was real. The reason was that the crisis was met by a level of motor transport effort Germany could not easily match and did not fully anticipate. The roads became crowded with trucks not because the system was comfortable, but because it was desperate. And desperation, organized well enough, can become power. A German commander looking at the map might have seen long American lines and expected vulnerability. An American driver looking through a dusty windshield saw something simpler. Keep moving. Keep the load tied down. Watch the truck ahead. Do not miss the turn. Do not sleep. Do not stop unless you must. The great pursuit across France depended on men whose war was measured less in yards of captured ground than in miles of road survived. And as August turned toward September, one question began to sit beneath every American plan. Could the trucks keep up with the victory the army had created? The men the army did not put in the headlines. The men who drove the Red Ball routes did not all look like the war posters. Many were black soldiers serving in a segregated army, wearing the same uniform as other Americans but living under different assumptions about where they belonged. The army needed their labor. It trusted them with fuel, ammunition, vehicles, and roads that mattered to entire campaigns. But it did not always grant them the respect that responsibility should have carried. That contradiction rode with them. It sat beside them in the cab. It stood with them at depots. It followed them into mess lines, barracks, and command structures. They were asked to help carry democracy across Europe while denied equality inside the institutions sending them there. No narrator has to force the irony. It was present every time a black driver climbed into a truck loaded with supplies for units that might receive more recognition in a single afternoon than he would receive in a lifetime. Yet the work had to be done. A driver did not have the luxury of turning history into argument while his engine was overheating. He had to watch the temperature gauge. He had to listen for changes in the sound of the motor. He had to know when the steering felt wrong, when the brakes began to fade, when the load shifted, when the truck ahead slowed too suddenly. A man could resent the system and still keep the convoy alive. Many did. The truck itself demanded attention. The American 2.5-ton cargo truck was tough, but not invulnerable. It could take punishment, carry weight, run rough roads, and be repaired more easily than more delicate machines. But thousands of miles of overloaded work broke things. Tires shredded, axles cracked, springs failed, engines lost power, radiators leaked, clutches burned. Drivers learned the personality of their vehicles the way sailors learned ships. A sound, a smell, a vibration through the floorboards could warn them before a breakdown became complete. Mechanics became a kind of priesthood of survival. They worked with cold fingers and dirty sleeves, sometimes with proper tools, sometimes with whatever was available. They lay under trucks while other vehicles growled past. They tightened, patched, hammered, cursed, and sent machines back out before any peacetime standard would have called the job finished. A repair did not have to be beautiful. It had to last one more run. Sometimes that was enough. The military police had their own version of the war. They stood at crossroads where one wrong turn could send a convoy into chaos. They read maps in darkness. They shouted over engines. They kept civilian carts, stray vehicles, and confused units from breaking the flow. A military policeman could seem like an irritation to a tired driver, waving him forward when every muscle wanted rest. But without traffic control, the Red Ball routes could have become immobile steel rivers. The loaders worked against time. Men heaved crates, drums, cans, tires, and boxes into truck beds until shoulders ached and hands split. Fuel cans were heavy before the first 100. Ammunition crates did not become lighter because the front needed them urgently. The work was repetitive, but repetition did not make it safe. A careless load could shift on a turn. A dropped crate could injure a foot. Fuel could spill. Sparks mattered. These were not small details to the men living them. History often compresses logistics into tonnage. 12,000 tons a day. Thousands of vehicles. Hundreds of miles. Those numbers matter. But numbers can flatten the human body. They do not show a driver blinking hard to stay awake. They do not show a mechanic's knuckles bleeding under a truck. They do not show a loader leaning against a stack of crates for 5 quiet seconds before someone calls him back. They do not show what it feels like to be necessary and overlooked at the same time. The combat soldiers at the front were not wrong to fear the enemy directly in front of them. A rifleman advancing through a village did not have to apologize for thinking his war was immediate. A tank crew crossing open ground under artillery fire did not need a lecture on logistics in that moment. The front was real. The danger there was real. But the rear was not safe in the way the word sometimes suggests. Convoys could be attacked. Roads could be mined. Aircraft could appear. Accidents could kill with no enemy nearby. Fatigue itself became an enemy without a uniform. A driver who nodded off for 2 seconds could kill himself and the men behind him. A truck carrying fuel could become a furnace. A mechanical failure on a narrow road could block the route and delay everything behind it. The men knew this. They did not speak about it in grand language. A man might slap the side of his truck and say, "Come on." He might tell another driver, "Keep your distance." He might ask a mechanic, "Will she make it?" The answer might be a shrug. "She better." That was the tone of the work. Not glory, necessity. German commanders did not see these men clearly. American public memory would not always see them clearly either. But the battlefield saw them in its own way. It responded when fuel arrived. It responded when ammunition arrived. It responded when a broken unit received parts, when an ambulance had gasoline, when a division did not have to stop as long as expected. The drivers and mechanics did not need to be called the real army to make it true in practice. They only had to keep moving, and that raised a hard question for the entire Allied campaign. If the men considered secondary were holding the advance together, what did that say about the way armies understood power? The answer began to appear on the roads themselves, where the Americans made a strange and urgent decision. They would turn traffic into strategy. The roads become arteries. The idea was almost plain enough to be missed. Take the roads. Mark them. Control them. Push trucks forward in priority convoys. Keep unnecessary traffic away. Move supplies east as fast as the men and machines can bear. It did not sound like a dramatic military innovation. There was no new gun, no secret aircraft, no special battlefield formation that could be drawn with a bold arrow. It was traffic discipline. It was signage. It was routing. It was dispatch. It was military police. It was paperwork made physical through engines and tires. But in late August 1944, that plain idea became one of the most important things happening in France. The Red Ball Express was not created because everything was under control. It was created because the normal system could not keep up. The Allied advance had outrun the orderly movement of supplies. Rail lines were damaged. Ports were limited. The front was moving. Emergency demanded simplification. If too many kinds of traffic used the same roads, nothing moved properly. If convoys took wrong turns, fuel vanished into delay. If trucks stopped casually, the rhythm broke. So the roads were disciplined. Red ball markers appeared. Certain routes became restricted. Vehicles were supposed to move in one direction along designated roads, then return by another route. Military police watched crossroads like gatekeepers of momentum. Drivers learned that the road itself had become part of the operation. To leave the system was to risk more than getting lost. It meant weakening a chain that thousands depended on. Imagine a French road after midnight. The fields are dark. A village ahead has only a few broken shapes where buildings used to catch the moonlight. The convoy crawls through, each truck holding its interval as well as the driver can manage. Dust hangs low in the air. The engine noise does not roar constantly. It rises and falls, gear by gear, hill by hill. Somewhere a loose tailgate bangs. Somewhere a man coughs. A military policeman flashes a covered light and points east. No one cheers. The work is too continuous for cheering. The red ball routes became arteries because the American front had become a body too large and hungry to feed casually. Supplies did not move simply because someone ordered them moved. They had to be sorted, loaded, documented, routed, protected, unloaded, and returned. The simple image of a truck driving from rear to front hides hundreds of small acts of coordination. A depot officer had to know what was needed and where. A loading crew had to put the right cargo on the right vehicles. Drivers had to be briefed or at least told enough not to lose themselves. Military police had to hold intersections. Maintenance crews had to keep the fleet alive. Units at the front had to receive and distribute what arrived. Then the trucks had to go back. The cycle was everything. A truck sitting empty too long was wasted capacity. A truck broken down on the road was worse. A truck loaded with the wrong cargo might arrive and still fail the men waiting for it. A truck lost in the wrong direction was not merely lost. It became proof that speed without control could become chaos. This was where American strength revealed one of its less romantic faces. The United States could produce machines, but production alone did not win the campaign. A truck built in America had to cross an ocean, reach a theater, be assigned, fueled, loaded, driven, repaired, and kept inside a system that made its movement useful. Industrial power became military power only when it reached the place of need. The Germans understood production. They understood roads. They understood supply. But they were increasingly trapped by shortages and by Allied air power that made movement dangerous. American trucks could move in a sky where Allied aircraft often dominated. German trucks, when they had fuel at all, moved under much harsher conditions. Rail lines were vulnerable. Daylight movement could be punished. Bridges could be watched. The same roads that enabled one army became killing grounds for the other. This asymmetry mattered. The Americans could be wasteful and still keep pressure alive. The Germans had to be careful and still could not restore freedom of movement. That did not mean German soldiers lacked skill or courage. Many fought stubbornly and effectively under terrible conditions. But courage cannot refill a fuel tank. Skill cannot replace a destroyed bridge by wishing. Tactical brilliance becomes smaller when the operational system behind it is starving. On the Red Ball roads, the Americans were not only moving supplies. They were moving the consequences of their economy, their standardization, their oil, their vehicle production, and their willingness to improvise under pressure. They were turning rear area labor into forward area tempo. That word, tempo, sounds clean. On the road, it was filthy. Tempo was a driver with a cramping leg. Tempo was a mechanic skipping sleep. Tempo was a military policeman waving through another convoy while dust coated his face. Tempo was a quartermaster unit unloading cargo by hand because the right equipment was somewhere else. Tempo was a truck patched well enough to survive one more trip. And every time the system worked, the battlefield changed. A German delaying action that might have bought 2 days bought one. A pause that might have allowed reorganization became shorter. A retreating unit that hoped the Americans would run dry saw more vehicles appear. Not always immediately, not always enough, but often enough to deny the larger recovery Germany needed. Still, the system was fragile. A few wrong assumptions could break it. Too many overloaded trucks, too many worn tires, too much sleep lost, too much distance. The roads could become arteries, but arteries can clog. Engines can fail. Men can collapse. Fuel can run out before it delivers more fuel. That was the paradox at the heart of the Red Ball Express. It was created to overcome exhaustion by exhausting men and machines even more. And soon, that exhaustion would be tested by the one American commander most associated with speed. Fuel for the race. George Patton did not like waiting. That is not the same as saying he never had to wait. War has a way of making even the most aggressive commanders stand still before things they cannot shout into motion. Fuel was one of them. Commander could demand it. He could argue for it. He could pressure headquarters, complain, calculate, and promise results. But fuel still had to arrive in cans and drums and tankers. It had to travel roads. It had to pass through hands. In the late summer of 1944, Patton's Third Army became one of the most visible symbols of American pursuit. Its armored columns pushed across France with a speed that seemed to confirm every German fear about mobility. But the faster Patton moved, the more dependent he became on the men behind him. His tanks could not drink reputation. His trucks could not run on confidence. His artillery could not fire arguments. They needed supplies. A tank crew waiting for fuel understands war differently from a staff officer. The crew has a machine that looks powerful from the outside. Armor, gun, tracks, radio, ammunition racks. A shape that civilians and enemies alike recognize as force. But when the fuel is low, that machine becomes quieter. Men check gauges. They ask when the truck is coming. They listen for engines on the road. The tank is still dangerous if attacked directly, but its larger purpose is suspended. Somewhere behind them, a driver is trying to make that suspension end. A red ball convoy run could begin in a place that did not look dramatic. A depot, a loading area, stacks of cans, crates, tires, boxes. Men moving under orders that seem too practical to carry emotion. Check the load. Tie it down. Watch the manifest. Fill the tank. Check the tires. Get in line. Then the convoy moves. The road takes over. At first there is the relief of motion. The truck responds. The load holds. The driver settles into the pattern of engine sound and distance. But as hours pass, the body becomes a problem. Shoulders tighten. Eyes dry out. Hands lose sensitivity. Dust gets into the mouth. The same view repeats until the mind begins to soften at the edges. Road, tailgate, brake light, dust, military policeman, village, road again. If enemy aircraft appear, the monotony breaks into panic. If artillery falls near a route, men learn how fast a supply mission can become a battlefield. But more often, danger comes without drama. A curve taken too quickly. A bridge weaker than expected. A truck ahead stopping suddenly. A tire exploding under weight. A driver misreading a sign in darkness. A moment of sleep. The front did not care how danger arrived. It only knew whether the cargo came through. Patton's demands made the pressure sharper, but the problem was larger than one army. Every Allied commander wanted supplies. First Army, Third Army, units moving toward Paris, units pushing east, units securing lines, airfields, hospitals, engineers, anti-aircraft batteries, signal units, all of them consumed. A modern army is not a knife. It is a city in motion, and every part of it eats. The Red Ball Express became famous because it tried to feed that city while the city was running. At times, the roads carried an almost unreal amount of material. Thousands of vehicles, day after day, hauling fuel, ammunition, rations, and parts. Later summaries would speak of tonnage, and tonnage is necessary because it gives scale. But for the men at the front, tonnage arrived as smaller, more intimate facts. A tank could move. A kitchen could serve. A gun could fire. A medic could open a box and find what he needed. There is no romance in a crate until someone is waiting for it. German commanders saw the American pressure continue and had to explain it. They knew the supply line was long. They knew the Americans were consuming at a ferocious rate. They knew ports and railways could not yet support everything smoothly. And still the pressure returned. Not everywhere. Not perfectly. But again and again enough of it returned. This was the painful part for Germany. The Americans could make mistakes and still move. They could suffer shortages and still resume. Their logistical system bent under the load, but it did not break in the way German hopes required. It stumbled forward in a cloud of dust, held together by men who were often invisible to the enemy and underappreciated by their own army. At the front, a unit might receive fuel late and curse the delay. Behind the front, the driver who delivered it might have spent the last day and night fighting to arrive at all. Both experiences were true. War does not arrange gratitude neatly. The fuel reached a tank. The tank moved. The movement created another demand for fuel. The cycle continued. For a German officer trying to rebuild a line, this was maddening. If the enemy stopped, you could breathe. If he paused, you could move reserves, organize guns, prepare demolition, choose ground. But if he paused only briefly, then came on again, every plan had to be shortened. Every retreat became more dangerous. Every delay position had less time to become real. American trucks were not winning battles by themselves, but they were changing the time available for battles to be fought. That was why the German expectation of a decisive American pause became so dangerous. It encouraged them to wait for a weakness that did exist, but not in the form they needed. The Americans were strained, but they were not helpless. They were overextended, but not immobilized. They were tired, but still moving. And the difference between tired and stopped is the difference between pursuit and recovery. Soon, German commanders would begin to feel that difference not as a theory, but as a repeated battlefield disappointment. They were waiting for the American army to run out of road. Instead, the road kept arriving with wheels under it. The pause that never became enough. There were moments when the German hope almost seemed reasonable. American units did pause. Fuel shortages were real. Supply officers did not always know how they would satisfy the next demand. Drivers could not be everywhere. Trucks broke down in large numbers. Roads became overloaded. Commanders competed for resources. The pursuit across France did not unfold as one continuous, effortless wave. A German officer hearing reports of American fuel trouble might have felt a grim satisfaction. Here, at last, was the old rule asserting itself. Distance was beginning to punish speed. The enemy was consuming too much. His tanks were too far forward. His supply line was stretched thin across a broken country. If German forces could hold, withdraw in order, or strike at the right moment, perhaps the situation could be stabilized. But the war did not give them the pause they needed. That is the difference that matters. An army can survive a problem if the enemy cannot exploit it quickly enough. The Americans had supply problems, but the Germans had supply problems of their own, and often worse. German units needed fuel too. They needed ammunition. They needed replacements. They needed transport. They needed time under skies where Allied aircraft made movement dangerous. They needed roads and railways that had not been smashed or watched. They needed command systems that could function amid retreat, bombing, and confusion. The American logistical crisis was serious. The German logistical crisis was existential. So when American pressure weakened, Germany could not always turn that weakness into recovery. A delaying unit might hold briefly, then find itself threatened again. A formation ordered to counterattack might lack fuel, vehicles, or freedom from Allied air attack. A headquarters might see an opportunity on the map and discover that reality outside the map had already closed it. This was where American trucks became more than transport. They denied Germany the luxury of time. Time to rebuild a line. Time to shift reserves. Time to rest men. Time to repair vehicles. Time to bring up ammunition. Time to think. War is often described through space. Towns taken, rivers crossed, borders reached. But campaigns are also fought over time. A commander who has 6 hours can do things a commander with 2 hours cannot. A retreat that happens at night under control is different from a retreat forced at noon under air attack. A fuel delivery that arrives before dawn changes what a division can do at first light. The Red Ball Express and the larger American transport effort did not erase friction. They compressed it. They made pauses shorter than the enemy required. They made American recovery faster than German planning assumed. They kept turning rear area labor into frontline pressure. For the men on the German side, this could feel less like a single defeat than a series of cruel surprises. A unit falls back expecting a day. The Americans arrive sooner. A road is blocked, expecting delay. Engineers and trucks find another way. A tank formation should be low on fuel. Somehow it appears again. An artillery unit should be silent. It fires. None of this meant American logistics was flawless. It meant it was resilient enough to disappoint the enemy at the moments when disappointment mattered most. That kind of power is hard to dramatize because it does not always explode. It accumulates. It shows itself in the absence of a hoped-for pause, in the attack that resumes, in the convoy that arrives late but not too late, in the German report that notes continued American movement when exhaustion had been expected. A German commander could understand a tank. He could respect a well-placed artillery barrage. He could fear fighter bombers. But how does one fight a system that turns thousands of ordinary trucks into operational momentum? Destroy one convoy, and another may move. Blow one bridge, and engineers search for another crossing. Delay one unit, and supply priority shifts. The system is vulnerable everywhere, yet hard to defeat everywhere at once. This is not because the system was gentle. It was wasteful in places, brutal to its own men in others, and dependent on a vast economy behind it. But war does not reward elegance for its own sake. It rewards what can continue under stress. The American truck columns continued. Sometimes barely, sometimes dangerously, but enough. On the German side, the realization came in fragments. Not one dramatic meeting where a general suddenly understood everything. More likely it arrived through reports that did not match expectation, through failed counterattacks, through prisoners mentioning fuel deliveries, through reconnaissance observing traffic density, through the steady presence of American material at places where it should have been harder to sustain. The Americans were not simply lucky. They had built a machine out of movement. By the time that became clear, the opportunity to exploit their weakness had often passed. There is a particular bitterness in realizing too late that the enemy's strength was visible all along. The trucks had been on the roads. The fuel cans had been in the cargo beds. The mechanics had been under the engines. The military police had been at the crossings. None of it was hidden in the way a codebook is hidden. It was hidden by assumption. German commanders had looked at support and seen support. The battlefield revealed something colder. Support was what allowed combat power to exist at the right place, at the right hour more than once. But this truth carried its own cost. The American system could keep moving only by consuming men and machines at a punishing rate. The trucks that stole time from Germany were also stealing sleep, safety, and years from the men behind the wheel. And beneath the grand movement across France, another kind of battle was being fought in smaller numbers. Gallons, tires, minutes, the mathematics of survival. A gallon is a small thing until an army needs millions of them. A tire is just rubber until a truck cannot move without it. A minute is nothing until an artillery battery is waiting, a tank battalion is dry, or a wounded man needs a medical truck that has not arrived. The mathematics of the Red Ball Express was never only mathematics. It was tension disguised as arithmetic. Reports could reduce the work to tonnage moved per day, vehicles assigned, miles covered, and supplies delivered. Those figures mattered because they revealed scale. But every number pointed back to a human act. Someone loaded that ton. Someone drove that mile. Someone changed that tire. Someone stayed awake for that minute. At peak operation, the Red Ball Express involved thousands of vehicles and moved thousands upon thousands of tons daily. Some accounts describe roughly 6,000 vehicles and more than 12,000 tons of supplies moving in a day at the height of the effort. What matters is not only whether one record gives a slightly different figure than another. What matters is what the number reveals. An army in pursuit was eating a mountain every day. Fuel was only the most obvious hunger. Trucks carried gasoline, but they also carried ammunition, rations, lubricants, medical supplies, blankets, tools, radio batteries, replacement parts, and tires. A division at the front could not live on one category of supply. Too much fuel without ammunition did not solve the problem. Ammunition without food created another. Spare parts without mechanics were promises waiting for hands. War required balance, but emergency often forced imbalance. Fuel received the loudest attention because a dry tank is instantly dramatic. But tires could become just as decisive. Roads in wartime were cruel to rubber. Trucks were overloaded. Drivers pushed speed where they could. Debris cut sidewalls. Heat, weight, distance, and rough surfaces destroyed equipment that no one at the front wanted to think about until it failed. A single tire failure was small. Many tire failures became a campaign problem. The same was true of maintenance. A truck is not a permanent fact. It is a temporary agreement between metal parts, fuel, oil, cooling, pressure, and repair. Every mile weakens the agreement. Every overload asks more of it. Every skipped inspection borrows from the future. Mechanics understood this better than commanders who saw only vehicle counts. A report might say a unit had trucks. A mechanic might know how many of those trucks were one hard trip away from failure. This gap between paper strength and usable strength is one of war's quieter dangers. It appears in every army. German commanders suffered from it painfully. Tanks listed on strength returns might lack fuel, parts, crews, or mechanical reliability. American forces had their own version. A truck assigned to the Red Ball Express was useful only if it could run, carry, return, and run again. The cycle punished weakness. Consider the cruel logic of fuel hauling. A truck carries gasoline forward, but the truck itself burns gasoline on the way. If the distance grows, the cost of delivery grows. If more trucks are assigned, more fuel is consumed by the delivery system. If the front moves farther, yesterday's solution becomes today's heavier burden. The Americans did not escape this law. They endured it. That distinction matters. The Red Ball Express was not proof that logistics problems disappeared under American abundance. It was proof that a wealthy, motorized, improvised, and ruthlessly busy system could keep functioning while problems multiplied. It was a way of staying ahead of collapse, not eliminating it. For German commanders, this was difficult to answer. They needed the American problem to become decisive. They needed fuel shortages to create a halt long enough to reorganize. They needed the mathematics to turn against the pursuit. But American mathematics had a different shape. A truck could break down, but 10 more might pass. A convoy could arrive late, but still arrive before the next attack window closed. A unit could be short, but not empty. A commander could complain bitterly about supply and still have enough to keep pressure alive. The difference between enough and not enough became one of the campaign's hidden borders. A tank with half the fuel it wants may still move for a limited attack. An artillery unit with fewer shells may still support a crucial action. A rifle company with delayed rations may still advance if ammunition arrives. War is not always decided by abundance. Sometimes it is decided by having barely enough at the necessary hour. The Red Ball drivers lived inside that hour. They did not speak of operational tempo. They spoke of destinations, loads, roads, repairs, food, sleep, and whether the truck would make it. Yet the sum of their labor became operational tempo. The sum of their fatigue became pressure. The sum of their repeated trips became the thing German commanders had not expected to face at such scale. There is a temptation to imagine logistics as clean because it involves numbers. In truth, logistics is where numbers become dirt. A ton of ammunition has weight. A gallon of fuel has smell. A tire has to be lifted. A broken axle has to be touched. A manifest has to match reality. A driver's eyes have to stay open. 12,000 tons per day is not an abstraction when the crates are in your hands and the road is still ahead. Somewhere in the chain, a man drops from the truck, stiff-legged, and walks around to check a strap. He hears engines behind him and knows he is slowing the line. He pulls hard, feels the rope burn his palm, climbs back in, and moves on. No one will build a monument to that moment. But campaigns are made of such moments. The Germans had believed the American advance would be defeated by distance. The distance did wound the Americans. It wore down trucks, consumed fuel, exhausted men, and forced hard choices. But the wound did not bleed fast enough to save Germany in France. The numbers kept moving. And when numbers move long enough, they become fate for the men standing in their path. But there was another side to those numbers. Every ton delivered had passed through a human body. Every mile demanded attention from men already stretched thin. The machine that carried the American army forward was powerful. It was also tired. And tired machines are repaired by tired men. Grease, dust, and the price of motion. The rear of an army has its own dead. They are harder to see because they do not always fall where photographers are looking. A truck wreck at night. A fuel fire after a crash. A driver crushed during recovery. A mechanic injured under a vehicle. A soldier killed when an enemy aircraft finds the road. These deaths do not fit neatly into the old image of battle, but they belong to war all the same. The Red Ball Express demanded motion from men who were already near the edge of what their bodies could give. Long driving hours blurred judgment. Dust inflamed eyes and lungs. Heat built inside cabs. Rain turned roads slick. Cold made fingers clumsy. Sleep became something stolen in fragments, under trucks, beside loads, in depots, on the ground, wherever a man could close his eyes without missing the next order. A driver who had been awake too long did not become dramatic. He became dangerous. He might miss a signal, drift toward a ditch, brake too late, take a curve wrong, forget a turn. In war stories, danger often announces itself with a shell burst or the rising whine of aircraft. Fatigue is quieter. It enters the body slowly and takes command by inches. The men knew it was happening. A driver might slap his own face, sing under his breath, smoke one cigarette after another, lean into the wheel as if posture alone could keep him conscious. Another man might talk to the truck, not because he believed it could hear, but because silence made sleep heavier. The engine's vibration became both companion and threat. Too steady and it lulled the brain. Too rough and it warned of breakdown. Mechanics fought a different exhaustion. Their war was fought on backs and knees, with grease in the nails and metal close to the face. A truck pulled from the route might arrive with a problem that deserved hours. The mechanic might have minutes. He had to decide what was essential, what could wait, what could be improvised, and what would kill someone if ignored. There is moral weight in such decisions. A bad repair could send a driver onto the road with false confidence. A delayed repair could keep supplies from the front. A perfect repair might be impossible. So the mechanic works between failure and urgency, knowing that war will blame him for both if things go wrong. He does not call it heroism. He calls it getting the truck back out. The same restrained language lived among many of the drivers. Men who survived hard work often describe it plainly because plain language is all that fatigue leaves behind. We drove. We hauled. We were tired. We kept going. The understatement should not fool anyone. There are kinds of endurance that become smaller when inflated. For black soldiers in the transport units, the cost of motion included the knowledge that their essential work did not erase discrimination. They could carry the fuel that carried an army and still return to a segregated order. They could be trusted with ammunition and denied equal dignity. The contradiction did not stop the convoys. It rode with them. This is one of the reasons their story has such force. Not because it needs to be turned into a simple moral fable, but because it refuses simplicity. They served a system that did not fully honor them. They helped defeat an enemy while confronting injustice inside their own ranks and society. They did work that was both ordinary and decisive. They were not symbols first. They were men. And men get tired. The American Army's momentum across France was therefore not only a triumph of organization. It was an extraction. It extracted labor from bodies. It extracted more performance from trucks than the trucks wanted to give. It extracted patience from officers, speed from roads, and discipline from men who had every reason to want rest. This price does not cancel the achievement. It explains it. German commanders, if they thought about the trucks at all, may have imagined a mechanical abundance. America had vehicles, fuel, factories, tires. That was true. But a truck does not drive itself through France in wartime. A tire does not change itself. A depot does not load itself. A convoy does not maintain discipline because a chart says it should. People made the system real, and people paid. In the cab of a truck, late at night, Private Jackson hears a change in the engine note. Not much. A roughness. A hesitation when he presses the accelerator. He glances at the gauges. The needle trembles under the dim light. He cannot diagnose much while moving. The truck ahead is still there. The convoy behind him is still there. The road is narrow. Stopping would create trouble. Continuing might create worse. He listens again. There it is. A cough in the engine. Maybe bad fuel. Maybe heat. Maybe nothing. Maybe the beginning of a breakdown that will leave him stranded with gasoline cans in the dark. This is the kind of decision that never appears on a campaign map. He eases the truck forward. Behind the great movement of armies, history is full of men deciding whether a machine can last a little longer. The front kept demanding. The roads kept answering. But no system can run on exhaustion forever without leaving marks. Some marks were written in maintenance records. Some in accident reports. Some in memories men carried home quietly. And when the campaign was later remembered, many of those marks faded behind the brighter images of tanks, generals, and liberated cities. The trucks had helped carry the victory. But recognition, like fuel, did not always arrive where it was needed when it was needed. When recognition arrived late, after the engines cooled, the story became easier to simplify. The Red Ball Express could be described in clean phrases: emergency supply route, trucking operation, logistical achievement, thousands of vehicles, thousands of tons. The Army could point to it with pride. Writers could turn it into a symbol of American energy. Later, films and articles could give the name a kind of shine. But the men inside the system remained harder to see. That is often how military memory works. It favors the visible edge of violence. A tank entering a town. A paratrooper in the doorway of an aircraft. A battleship firing. A flag raised. A general speaking to troops. These images are not false. They matter, but they do not contain the whole war. The whole war is too large, too dirty, too repetitive, too dependent on labor that does not photograph cleanly. A truck convoy is difficult to make legendary because its greatness lies in repetition. One trip is useful. 1,000 trips become strategy. A driver unloading fuel does not look like the turning point of a campaign. But if enough drivers fail to arrive, the campaign changes. The absence would have been obvious. The presence was easier to take for granted. For many Red Ball drivers, especially black soldiers, recognition was filtered through the same inequality that shaped their service. Their work was necessary, sometimes praised in general terms, but the individual names were rarely preserved with the same care given to combat commanders. A man could have driven through exhaustion, danger, and discrimination, then come home to a country still unwilling to see him fully. There is no need to exaggerate that to make it powerful. It is powerful because it is true. The official story eventually acknowledged the Red Ball Express as a remarkable logistical effort. It had to. The scale was too large to ignore. The operation ran for weeks during one of the most urgent phases of the campaign in France. It helped sustain the Allied pursuit at a moment when conventional supply systems could not yet carry the full burden. Its name survived because the need it answered was undeniable. But official recognition and human remembrance are not the same. A unit citation, a report, a post-war article, a film, these can preserve the outline. They cannot fully recover the smell of fuel in a cab, the sound of a wrench dropped on cold ground, the anger of being treated as lesser while doing essential work, the fear of falling asleep behind the wheel, or the quiet satisfaction of seeing cargo unloaded and knowing the front would move again. The German realization was also indirect. German commanders did not necessarily gather around a table and declare that American trucks were the real army. War rarely offers such clean moments. More likely, they realized it through accumulated failure. The expected halt did not last. The enemy pressure resumed. American artillery remained supplied. Tanks reappeared. Infantry kept receiving enough to continue. The pattern became impossible to dismiss. They had believed that American combat power would be limited by the old vulnerabilities of distance. What they faced was a nation that could turn distance into a logistical problem and then throw engines, fuel, men, and organization at that problem until it bent. Again, not perfectly, but sufficiently. That word matters. Sufficiently. The American supply system did not need to satisfy every commander's wish at every hour. It needed to keep enough pressure on Germany to prevent recovery. It needed to move enough fuel, enough ammunition, enough food, enough parts, enough medical supplies, enough of the time. In war, enough can be devastating. For the men at the front, delayed recognition may not have mattered in the moment. A tank crew cared whether fuel arrived. An infantryman cared whether ammunition and rations arrived. A wounded man cared whether the medical chain functioned. Gratitude, when it came, was probably local and brief. A nod, a joke, a shouted thanks, a hand raised as the truck pulled away. Then the driver turned back. That was another aspect of the job. Arrival did not end it. The truck had to return. The route had to be run again. A man who had just completed one exhausting mission could not rest inside the meaning of it. The system only existed if he repeated it. This repetition is why the Red Ball Express still matters. It forces a different understanding of military power. Not the single decisive moment, but the repeated act that makes decisive moments possible. Not the commander alone, but the chain of unknown people who make command meaningful. Not the weapon in isolation, but the fuel, ammunition, repair, and transport that allow the weapon to exist in battle. There is a quiet correction here. The real army is not only the part that fires. It is also the part that feeds the firing. And the men who performed that work deserved more than background status. They were not accessories to the campaign. They were part of the campaign's muscle and blood. By the time recognition settled into history, many had already returned to ordinary life, carrying memories that did not always fit the heroic language later applied to them. Some may have remembered the roads more than the strategy, the sleep more than the speeches, the engine trouble more than the headlines, the feeling of finally stopping, if only for a moment, and hearing silence where the engine had been. Yet the legacy of their work reached far beyond France. Because the lesson of 1944 was not simply that trucks mattered. It was that modern war had changed the meaning of force itself. Movement became firepower. Firepower is usually imagined at the moment of release. The gun fires. The shell leaves the barrel. The bomb falls. The machine gun opens. The tank round strikes armor. That is the visible instant, the one the eye understands. It is loud, cinematic, undeniable. But before firepower appears, it has already traveled a long road. The shell was manufactured, shipped, unloaded, stored, transported, issued, lifted, loaded, and fused. The gun was built, delivered, maintained, supplied, crewed, and moved into position. The men firing it were fed, clothed, armed, transported, treated when sick, replaced when wounded, and kept inside a command system that told them where to aim. Firepower begins far behind the muzzle. The American campaign in France made that truth hard to ignore. Movement became firepower because movement allowed firepower to arrive and reappear. A Sherman tank was not simply a tank. It was the visible end of a supply system. A rifle company was not only men with weapons. It was a consumer of ammunition, food, medical care, and replacements. An artillery barrage was not only guns firing. It was trucks, depots, roads, and labor converted into explosions. German commanders had once mastered operational movement in ways that shocked Europe. But by 1944, Germany no longer possessed the same freedom to move, and the Americans had turned mass motorization into a different kind of tempo. The U.S. Army could be awkward, argumentative, and imperfect, could suffer from poor coordination, traffic jams, waste, and command disputes. But it could also sustain motion with a depth that reflected the industrial world behind it. This is why the image of the truck deserves more weight. The truck was not glamorous. It did not dominate propaganda in the same way as a fighter plane or a tank. It did not have the sleek menace of a battleship or the immediate drama of an infantry assault. But it connected everything. It shortened the distance between production and battle. It gave commanders options. It gave units second chances. It turned supplies into pressure. A German unit facing American forces might destroy a tank and still face another. It might delay an infantry advance and still hear artillery the next morning. It might expect fuel shortages to halt a pursuit, only to find that enough gasoline had arrived through the night. The truck did not eliminate German resistance. It made resistance harder to convert into recovery. That is a subtle but decisive distinction. In war, stopping the enemy for an hour may mean nothing if he can resume before you reorganize. Stopping him for a day may matter. Stopping him for a week may change a campaign. German commanders needed American logistics to fail at the level of days and weeks. Too often, it failed at the level of hours, local shortages, temporary pauses, and angry commanders, painful but not always decisive enough. The Red Ball Express was part of that difference. Its legacy can be heard in later military thinking, where logistics is not treated as a passive rear area function but as a foundation of operational reach. Armies that move fast must be fed fast. Armies that depend on machines must repair machines. Armies that fire heavily must carry heavy loads. No doctrine survives if the supply system beneath it cannot breathe. The lesson sounds obvious after the fact. It was not obvious enough before the fact. That is why the German realization came too late. They did not fail to understand that armies needed supply. They failed to appreciate how the American system, under pressure, could turn supply into a form of sustained attack. They expected distance to slow the Americans more than it did. They expected destroyed infrastructure to impose longer pauses. They expected the enemy's appetite to outrun his ability to feed it. The appetite was enormous, but so was the feeding machine. And inside that machine were ordinary men doing work that modern war made extraordinary. Drivers, mechanics, loaders, dispatchers, military police, quartermasters, men whose names did not define operations on maps, but whose labor gave those operations physical reality. Commander can draw an arrow toward Germany. A truck driver has to make that arrow move. There, perhaps, is the simplest truth of the campaign. Strategy is imagined in rooms, but it travels by road, crosses bridges, it waits at fuel points, it breaks down, it gets repaired, it arrives late or just in time or not at all. Every grand decision must eventually become a vehicle moving through weather with a human being inside it. The Americans had many weapons in 1944. Tanks, aircraft, artillery, infantry, engineers, naval power, intelligence, industry. None of them should be reduced to a single explanation. War resists that, but the trucks reveal the connective tissue. They show how power becomes usable. They explain why an army that looked overextended could remain dangerous. They show why German commanders waiting for a collapse often received only a pause. The truck was not the whole army, but without it, the army could not remain itself. That is the legacy hidden in the dust behind the spearhead. And it brings us back to the road outside Chartres before dawn, where the war was not being announced by a general, but carried in metal cans behind a tired driver. The army behind the army. By the time the sky began to pale, Private Jackson's truck was still moving. The road had changed color slowly, from black to gray to the weak blue of early morning. Fields emerged on either side, flat and damp. The shapes of trees returned. A village appeared ahead with broken roofs and shuttered windows. Somewhere a dog barked once, then stopped. The convoy rolled through as if the night had never ended. Jackson's hands hurt from the wheel. His eyes felt raw. The engine still had that roughness in it, but it had not quit. Not yet. Behind him, the jerrycans had settled into a steadier rhythm. Metal against metal. Fuel inside metal. Motion inside exhaustion. At a forward supply point, men would unload the truck quickly. Perhaps there would be no ceremony. No one would ask him to describe the road. Someone might check the cargo, sign a paper, point him where to turn. A tank crew might get some of that gasoline. An artillery tractor might get some. Command jeep. An ambulance. The fuel would vanish almost immediately into other machines, other orders, other risks. That was the strange fate of logistics. When it worked, it disappeared. The gasoline did not remain as proof. It became movement. The ammunition did not remain in crates. It became fire. The spare part did not remain in a box. It became a repaired vehicle. The ration did not remain stacked in a depot. It became one more day a soldier could function. The truck arrived, and its importance dissolved into the army it kept alive. German commanders had believed that the American advance was the armored column, the artillery barrage, the infantry pushing through towns, the aircraft overhead. They believed, with reason, that distance would punish those forces. They believed destroyed roads, broken railways, damaged ports, fuel consumption, and exhaustion would force the Americans into pauses Germany might exploit. But what really happened was more difficult to stop. Behind the visible army was another army. Drivers, mechanics, loaders, military police, depot crews, dispatchers, clerks, engineers, and quartermasters. Men with grease on their sleeves, dust in their eyes, and too little sleep in their bodies. Men who drove through darkness with cargo that did not look heroic until someone at the front needed it. Men who were often ignored by the stories told afterward because their work did not fit the clean image of battle. They were not invincible. They were not perfect. The system they served was strained, wasteful at times, and unjust in ways that should not be softened. Trucks broke down. Convoys got lost. Men were injured and killed. Supplies arrived late. Commanders cursed shortages. The American advance did not float across France on abundance. It ground forward on effort. That is the more honest truth. The trucks did not make war easy. They made continued pressure possible. They shortened German opportunities. They turned temporary pauses into movement again. They carried the fuel that gave tanks another mile, the shells that gave artillery another hour, the rations that gave infantry another day, the medical supplies that gave wounded men another chance. The German army had once taught Europe the terror of speed. In France in 1944, German commanders faced a different version of speed, one powered not only by armored tactics but by transport depth. Not just by spearheads but by supply lines that refused to stay still. Not just by generals but by tired men driving through dust before sunrise. And by the time the truth became clear, it had already done its work. The pause Germany needed had not lasted long enough. The roads had kept feeding the front. The trucks had kept coming. Near the end of a run, a driver might switch off the engine and sit for a moment in the sudden quiet. After so many hours of vibration, silence could feel unnatural. His hands might still tremble slightly, not from fear alone, but from the memory of the wheel. He might smell gasoline even after stepping away from the truck. He might close his eyes and still see the road. Then someone would call for him. Another load. Another run. Another night. They believed the Real Army was the force they could see at the front. The tanks, the guns, the infantry, the aircraft, the hard steel edge of American power. But what really happened was this. The edge only kept cutting because behind it, mile after mile, men kept the army alive on wheels. And sometimes, in war, the most decisive weapon is not the one that fires. It is the one that arrives. If you are watching from a place connected to this history, a town, a port, a road, a family memory, share it in the comments. And if someone in your family served, whether at the front or in the long unseen chain behind it, their story matters here. Subscribe to WW2 Warfront for more forgotten stories of what they believed and what really happened.